What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you non-Catholic listeners have a question about the Catholic faith that has been bothering you for a while, well, give us a call. Love to take a crack at that, explain to you exactly what the Church teaches definitively on that subject. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can always send us an email. The address ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. We try to hit a couple of emails on each one of our live shows. All right, Dan, we have ready to rock and roll here. It is Charles Beery, our producer. We also have, I had to pause there thinking, well, who's doing the phone screening today? It's Rich Jesse. And we have Jeff Burson handling social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook Live, we're streaming there right now. Just put that question of yours in the comments box. Jeff will shoot that to us here in Studio One. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing decent, thank you.
Yesterday at the very end of the show, and we actually kind of ran out of time, but someone who called in had a question about the Apostolic Pardon. And,
yes.
And this is something that comes kind of at the end of life,
yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And this person was saying, well, golly, my uncle was, received the last rites, but didn't get the Apostolic Pardon because the priest didn't know anything about that.
Or I think more specifically, he said the priest didn't know that he had faculties to grant it.
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so the question was, where can he find it stated that priests have faculties to grant the apostolic pardon along with last rites?
Yeah,
and I'm not a priest, so I never have to worry about whether I have faculties to grant that. So I was like, let me go check out where it's actually printed.
Well, first of all, what is an apostolic pardon?
Yes, it is a type of plenary indulgence. So a plenary of indulgence is when the church, through the merits and prayers of the saints, grants the remission of all the temporal punishment due to sin to someone who's properly disposed and in the state of grace.
Okay.
So this is a plenary indulgence granted to the dying so that they can have all the temporal punishment of their sin remitted at the moment of their death. And the priest has faculties to do that from the Holy See, from the Pope. And I actually, right after we left, I walked out of the studio and I ran into one of our EWTN priests who also happens to be a canonist.
Okay.
And I said, where's that actually written? And he said, it's in the ritual. It's actually in the pastoral care of the sick that the priest takes with him that would instruct him in how to do the last rites. It's also in the Enchiridion of Indulgences.
Okay.
So it's right there in the book. All you got to do is read it.
This is very good news.
Yep.
All right, very good. So we thank you for that. And here's a question we received from Jacob. Can Dr. Anders please explain in more detail why we cannot, quote, feel the Holy Spirit working in our lives? I know he has mentioned in the past how folks attribute feelings to the Holy Spirit and that this is not the case. I would like a good explanation of this so that I can convey it to my loved ones who want to go to Protestant churches because they like the feelings they get. But I need some grounding, not just saying that's not the Holy Spirit working. Thanks, Jacob.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question. So the easiest way to see this is to look at the example of Jesus himself.
Okay.
And think of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane or on the cross when he was experiencing this dereliction of soul and this and suffering, both physically and psychologically, all of the alienation and hurt and loneliness and abandonment that a person can be oppressed with. It was not a happy, clappy time for Jesus on the cross at all.
No.
And yet he was perfectly united to the Godhead. absolutely no division whatsoever at all. And so spirituality, holiness, union with God is compatible with any number of emotional states, whether they be happiness and joy, or sorrow, or loss, or even aridity. And the teaching of the Church is that all of these emotional conditions can be occasions for deeper union with God, because the union that we seek with God is not a union just in our emotionality, which after all is something that we share with animals. Before I came to the studio today, I took my dog for a walk, and you should have seen him. He was jumping all over the place like a jumping bean. He had plenty of emotionality, right? He was as enthusiastic as anybody at a revival meeting I've ever seen, you know. But he has no spirituality, my dog, okay? So it's not our animal emotionality that we're seeking principally to unite with God. It's our will. It's our will. We want to be united with God in our will through charity, through love. And love is most certainly not an emotion. It's a settled disposition of mind to be united to another and to seek their integral good. And if you're a parent or a spouse, you know you can love somebody and be angry. You can love somebody and be sad. You can love somebody and feel rejected. You can love somebody and be hopeful. You can love somebody and be joyful. You can love somebody and be bored out of your skull, right? Love is not an emotion, and we seek to be united with God principally in our will through charity. Now, emotions are the context in which we make our acts of will, and so they can be a great help to us. Obviously, if I'm feeling joyful or happy or excited or hopeful or whatever, it's easier for me to make acts of charity. It's easier if my emotional life comes along, and so we should seek to cultivate a healthy emotional life, but it would be a mistake to equate our spiritual good with positive emotions.
Okay. Well, very good. And Jacob, thank you so much for your email. If you have a question that you would like to put to an email and you want to send that to us, we'll try to get to as many emails as we can. The address ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. As I mentioned earlier, we try to tackle, at least one, maybe two emails per show. And then every now and then, about once a month, I guess, we do a mailbag program where we just tackle a whole bunch of emails, and those are always a lot of fun. So again, the address, ctc@ewtn.com. Phone lines are filling up fast. We have Rob standing by in Grand Rapids, Tom in Twinsburg, Ohio, Christopher in Mount Pleasant, Texas. Sheila is getting screened right now. We have two lines open at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986.
Then there's a prayer that comes from fear. A lot of people are converted with this kind of prayer. The old saying, there's no atheists in foxholes. Well, I hope that's true. It's amazing that sometimes the greatest conversions happen when somebody is so afraid they suddenly reach out to God. Maybe their whole life they never reached out to God, and suddenly they cry, Lord, help me. Okay? Conversion.
Pursue what matters most in 2022. Life, liberty, truth. From the Capitol to the classroom, from the pulpit to the pew, EWTN's National Catholic Register delivers in-depth news, analysis, and commentary through the lens of the Catholic faith. With so much at stake in our country, there's never been a more important time to read the Register. And with award-winning Catholic journalism that goes beyond what you'll find from any secular news service, you'll get the real story behind the events that unfold over the course of the year. Try the Register for free today and get it delivered to your home, office, or parish. Get 6 free issues today online at ncregister.com/radio. Or call 800-421-3230 and mention code RADIO. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully.
It's called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this rather chilly Thursday afternoon, at least here in Birmingham, on EWTN Radio. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. I want to tell you about something wonderful that's now available from EWTN's religious catalog. It is the Way of the Cross for Kids DVD, accompanied by a free coloring book. In this animated special, Christine, Eva, Joseph, and Enrique follow the 14 stations of the passion and death of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is an inspirational program which introduces children to a familiar Catholic observance in languages and images appropriate to their level of understanding. Now, the disc itself is one disc, 30 minutes long, included our English and Spanish versions. So do check that out. And we're throwing in a free coloring book. It's a fun and creative way for children to learn about the sufferings of Jesus as he approached his death. Wonderful thing offered to you from EWTN's religious catalog. It's available right now at EWTNRC.com. You know, Lent is just around the corner. This is a good thing to get for those kids in your life, perhaps a godchild, a grandchild. It's available right now at EWTNRC.com. And if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin today with Rob in Grand Rapids, listening on Holy Family Radio. Hello, Rob. What's on your mind today? Hey, Rob. What's going on?
Yeah. I was talking to my dad, and he was trying to discount the importance of Mary using Luke 11:27 and 28, where it says, "Blessed is the woman, or the breast that fed you, and the womb that bore. Rather, more blessed is he who obeys, or hears my commands and obeys them," I believe, and I just wondered what your take on that was.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So, Jesus' point is that physical parentage is of very little value compared with the spiritual affinity of those who love God and follow him and seek to be Christ's disciples. And that's true. That's true. So if the only thing that Mary contributed to in giving birth to Jesus were genetics, then it would be pretty extraordinary, but that in itself would not make her worthy of veneration. Okay. Right? But in view of the genetics, in view of the biological parturition of the Son of God, God also granted to Mary a particular dignity, namely that she would be immaculately conceived and preserved from every stain of original or actual sin, that she would be imminent in charity and contemplation, and therefore be the greatest of all creatures, and worthy of ultimate veneration. Now, he granted her this dignity of holiness in view of the dignity of becoming the Mother of God. He could have done it differently. I mean, it's possible that Christ could have become incarnate in some other fashion, but God chose to do it this way because it was so fitting for our redemption, given that through the disobedience of a man and a woman, sin came into the world and the human race was ruined. It was fitting that through the obedience of a man and a woman, of course, the God-man Jesus Christ and his mother Mary, that the second Adam and the second Eve would be the inauguration of the redemption of the human race. Okay.
Appreciate that. Rob, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you call right now, we can probably get you screened and hooked up and ready to go on today's program. That would be a very good thing. Here now is Tom. Tom is listening to us in Twinsburg, Ohio on AM 1260, The Rock. Hey there, Tom. What's on your mind today, sir?
Dr. Anders has mentioned doctors of the church several times. I was wondering, what's the procedure for making a doctor of the church? Is it just up to the Pope? Could, say, the Venerable Fulton Sheen become a doctor of the church, although there's some trouble with his body's location, keeping him from getting canonized? That's a separate question.
Sure, I understand the question. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So, there was a tradition in the Middle Ages of identifying four doctors of the church from the Latin West: Augustine, Gregory, Jerome, and Ambrose. And so the title was one basically of a kind of popular acclaim among theologians who regarded these as real seminal figures, pillars among theologians. And then in the early modern period, the popes the popes, on their own authority, began to expand the range of the title and apply it to others that they thought were also exemplary in their theology and in their teaching. And so today, the procedure for being named a doctor is the Pope names you a doctor. And as to whether or not Fulton Sheen would be named a doctor of the Church, of course, I'm not going to try to handicap the Holy See, right? They're going to do what they want to do. But in my judgment, my private judgment, which is, that and $3 now will buy you a cup of coffee, okay?
Maybe.
But in my private judgment, I think it's unlikely. And I'll tell you why. Because the people that are named doctors, generally speaking, have a tremendous influence on the whole of Catholic intellectual and spiritual life, and bring some insight that profoundly deepens the grasp that the faithful have on the nature of the deposit of faith, on the mystery of Christ. Paradigm example is St. Augustine of Hippo. Up until Augustine of Hippo, for 4 centuries, it was almost unheard of for people to give an analysis of the process of salvation in terms of original sin, grace, and justification. That language was there was a different idiom at use in soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. Augustine's work in soteriology, that's the doctrine of salvation, and ecclesiology, that's the doctrine of the Church, just fundamentally reoriented the theological vision of the West in a way that's perennial. I mean, you'll still find the categories that Augustine gave us in the Catechism of the Catholic Church today. I mean, he really defined kind of the shape and tone and tenor of Latin Christianity. Thomas Aquinas, another doctor of the Church. Thomas set forth sort of the authoritative way of thinking about the relationship of faith to reason, science and spirituality in a way that is the model for all Catholic thinkers from here on out. Some people have made noises hoping that John Henry Cardinal Newman, St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, might one day be named a doctor of the Church. And I think the reason why he's got a chance at being named a doctor is he's sometimes called the doctor of the Second Vatican Council. Because Newman's theological vision, his understanding of the scope of the history of Catholic theology and what's called the development of doctrine, was profoundly influential in the whole of 20th century Catholic theology and the articulation of the Second Vatican Council. So it's had really kind of a universal influence on the entire Catholic world. That's the kind of thing that usually you're looking for in a doctor of the Church. Fulton Sheen, fantastic communicator of the gospel, absolutely wonderful evangelist. We are big Fulton Sheen fans around here. But in terms of original contributions to theology, his contribution was someplace else.
Yeah, okay. Well, very good. And Tom, thank you so much for your call. By the way, David, that's a very timely question that we received from Tom.
Is that right?
Because only 7 days ago, Pope Francis declared Saint Irenaeus
bingo
as the next doctor of the Church.
That's about 1,900 years too late for my money.
Yeah.
Oh, I love Irenaeus.
Good stuff there. Tom, thanks again for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to Communion in Progress here on EWTN Radio. We do have 3 lines open right now. Okay, here's a question now from Abigail, listening to us on YouTube. Abigail says, I just ran across a, quote, history of the Nazarene Church that says the Catholic Church was started in 1054 during the Great Schism. Can Dr. Anders speak to that possibly?
I sure can. Thank you very much. For what it's worth, the Nazarene Church was founded in the 19th century. Okay,
good point. Yeah,
it's an outgrowth of the Wesleyan holiness movement in North America. Yeah, that's absurd. That's absurd. It really is absurd. And you don't have to be a Catholic to see that it is absurd, because the idea of Catholicism is that Christ founded a visible institution with a determinate form of faith and worship and lines of authority and continuity that extend indefinitely into the future. That's the basic idea in Catholicism. Well, we find that represented in the Bible. It's there in the first century. It's very evidently there in the first century. Jesus said to the apostle, said to St. Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And to all the apostles, "Go and make disciples of all nations, teach them everything I've commanded you, and I'll be with you to the end of the age." And by the institution of that church, Christ intended a universal society that had jurisdiction over all its members, regardless of which particular church they lived in. That's why in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, the apostles could legislate for the entire Christian world because they were conscious of belonging to a single, coherent, determinate body, i.e. the Catholic Church. The term Catholic was applied to that body, to that institution, for the first time by Ignatius of Antioch in the very, very early 2nd century. And, of course, the fathers of the Church who were conscious of their continuation from the apostles, their succession from the apostles, were meeting in council, in ecumenical councils like the Council of Nicaea in 325, and again, legislating doctrine and practice to be binding, to be normative for the entire Christian world. The Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed that we recite in Mass every week from the Council of Constantinople, 381, understands itself, refers to itself as one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So the idea that this entity only came into existence in 1054 is just patently absurd.
Yeah. Well, we do appreciate your question, Abigail. Thanks for watching us today on YouTube. Call to Communion here on EWTN. One line open right now at 833-288-EWTN. Let's go to one of our podcast listeners. It's Christopher. He is in Mount Pleasant, Texas. Christopher, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Okay, 2 questions real quick. I'm going to be as fast as I can. The first one, okay, I'm a Catholic now. I've been a Catholic since 2018. I was raised Southern Baptist. Now, I have been divorced in my life, but one of the biggest issues that pushed me out of the Southern Baptist Church was the lack of teachings on marriage and divorce. I would sit in Sunday school classes and Bible study group, and when we studied the 10 Commandments, they get to the adultery commandment, and the only thing that they would say is, Jesus said if you did it in your heart, you did it. Now, I'm trying to live a single and celibate life now and be holy about that. And I had a real issue because when you've got people in the group who are unlawfully divorced and remarried, and you bring that up and say, well, what about getting divorced and remarried? And they say simply, well, we're all sinners, Jesus forgives. And it's like, so you're telling me not to even think it, but this guy gets to go home and continue to be with.
So how can I help you?
And so my question is, am I being Pharisaic in my attitude?
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. I think I can speak to that. So it is not wrong to want to have consistency and coherence in your theology. That is not a bad thing. And I think there are a couple of reasons why your Baptist friends have a difficult time with this. One is, as you know, in the Baptist world, the only way they can do moral theology is they attempt to exegete it from the express words of the Bible. So if the Bible condemns it, it's wrong. If the Bible enjoins it, it's mandatory. If the Bible is silent, then they think it must be okay. And that is an entirely insufficient way to think about morality, because the Bible doesn't speak to so many issues and doesn't speak with one voice on other moral issues. So between the Old Testament and the New, you're going to get different perspectives on whether it's lawful to divorce your wife, for example, and you can only make sense of that in light of the full revelation of Jesus as interpreted by sacred tradition and in accord with natural law. And so you just need a much bigger data set to reason well about moral questions than the Baptist is equipped to do. And then secondly, because they don't have a good doctrine of ecclesial authority, they have no way of determining whether marriages are valid or invalid, other than the subjective sense of the people involved. If somebody comes and presents himself as married, well, the Baptist has no way of gainsaying that. I mean,
right.
they've got no criteria to define valid versus invalid marriage. And so they don't know what to do with the marital ambiguities that are so common in the modern world. And because they have a doctrine of grace that Jesus just forgives everything, on the one hand, they will say, well, you absolutely ought not to commit adultery, but if you do, oh well, Oh, well, and they can't do much better than that, okay? And it's understandable that would drive you nuts, and you would want to go someplace that had a clearer moral theology and a more coherent ecclesiology, and a church that actually could rule on the validity or invalidity of marriages and bring clarity to these kinds of moral issues. So that's not wrong of you to want to have clarity in your moral thinking. How else are you going to make moral choices if you don't have moral clarity in your thinking? I think that's very good. Now, what would be pharisaical, I think, would be if, armed with this knowledge, you decide to go out and make sure that every Baptist in the world understands Catholic theology. You know, and that's not what Christ has told us to do. I mean, our job is not to. He says we're supposed to take the log out of our own eye before we take the splinter out of our neighbor's. And we primarily evangelize by being transformed in charity and having the mind of Christ, so that we can be Christ to people who live in darkness, and they don't have moral clarity, so we try to live morally clear lives, morally pure lives, so that we can evangelize by attraction through the power and holiness and the love of our own hearts.
Great question, great call. Thank you so much for it, Christopher. Glad you're listening to us via podcasting. In a moment, getting back to the phones with Bill in Columbus, Dave in Virginia, Jerry in Porterville, California, Luke in Ave Maria, Florida. Lots more straight ahead on EWTN's Call to Communion.
I was listening to the EWTN, and you were on with one of your little snippets, and you said some words that brought me back to the church. I've been away for a long time. You don't know how much I appreciate those words, and I don't know why those particular words that day got to me.
EWTN, helping people grow in their love and understanding of God.
This is Dr. David Anders. If you missed part of today's show, catch the encore tonight at 11 Eastern. Check out the podcast anytime at EWTNradio.net and click Podcasts.
This is a Messy Family Minute with Mike and Alicia Hernan. We talk a lot on our program about the messiness of life, but we thought we should take a moment to explain why it's important. We live in a broken, fallen world, and we're constantly trying to repair relationships and situations that have become, well, messy.
Why is it so important to recognize this? Because if we deny or ignore this reality, or try to control our situation and make it neat and perfect, we'll only end up frustrating ourselves and making the situation worse.
Family life is never easy. St. John Paul recognized this when he wrote, "There is no family that does not know how selfishness, discord, and tension can wound the family. But every family is called by the God of peace to have the joyous and renewing experience of reconciliation and unity restored."
Families need to embrace the mess, knowing that God is always calling us to reconciliation with Him and our families, and that He will give us the grace we need to get there. For more inspiration, visit us at messyfamilyminute.org.
You pick the topics for conversation.
It's Unscripted tomorrow on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
On most of these EWTN stations.
Now back to Call to Communion.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Our phone number, and we have two lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Going now to Columbus, Nebraska, and Bill, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio, 102.7 FM. Hey there, Bill. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. Real quick, and then I'll hang up so I can listen to you.
Okay.
The Gospel tells us on the parable of the sower that Jesus tells the disciples that the secrets of the kingdom were not meant for some, apparently, seemingly, and that for them to hear them, that they would turn and be forgiven. And I just want to know what your thoughts on that are, with that gospel story. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I love this question. This is a magnificent question. So you'll notice that when Jesus engages the text of the Old Testament, that he reads it sometimes in ways that seem quite surprising or paradoxical even. I think it's Psalm 137, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Jesus says, that means me. That means me. No, you go look at the text. It's not evident that means Jesus from the literal sense of the text. The book of Leviticus chapter 20 says that adulterers should be put to death. Jesus says, no, they don't. No, they don't. Pentateuch also says that men can divorce their wives. Jesus says, no, they can't. And so he's always kind of engaging the Old Testament in ways that are a little bit shocking to some of his contemporaries. And the secret, I think, to all of this is that Jesus is sort of doubling down on a theme that was very common in the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and so forth, and that is that God doesn't desire the blood of goats and bulls or merely ritual observances. What he desires is a contrite heart, the gift of self that would eventuate in sharing one's bread with the hungry and taking in the homeless and caring for the poor and doing justice to one's neighbor and having a reformed life. That's a very common prophetic theme. Jesus takes that and really presses it to its logical conclusion, which is that the whole of the law and the prophets is summed up in the command to love God and love neighbor, and everything else has to be interpreted in light of that. And so something like Mosaic permission to divorce your wife has to be measured against the higher command that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And so, you know, if you're a Judean man in the first century and you divorce your wife because she burnt the toast and you reduce her to penury or to dependence or whatever, and you take the bank account and run off and play golf, that's not charitable. And so Christ says, no, it's not that way from the beginning, but God made them male and female, said the two have become one flesh. What God joins together, man cannot separate. There's a higher principle at work. Thus, the Mosaic law was a concession to human weakness, you see.
Yes.
Now, Jesus understood, as did St. Paul, that if you read the Old Testament, or at least portions of it, kind of as the man on the street would understand it. You pick up the text, you just read it in a straightforward fashion and just say, I'll just do what it says is easy. It's an instruction book. It's a guidebook. It's going to lead you in places that you don't want to go. So go back to those texts about let's put to death people who break the Sabbath or who commit adultery or who, forget to wash before sundown. If you take that in a straightforward, uninterpreted kind of way, you get Saul before his conversion. Saul, who says, well, here are these Christians. They're not keeping the Sabbath like I want them to. They're running around eating with Gentiles. They're doing all kinds of nonsense. Let's put them to death. Let's kill them. And he does. He kills them.
Yeah.
And he thinks that he is God's good servant because he is obeying what he understands to be the literal text of the law. Then he meets Jesus. And wasn't he in for a shock? And what he thought was going to be his redemption would have been his damnation. And the people he went to persecute become for him the way of salvation as he learns to show them charity. Rather than putting them to death, he learns from them and gives himself to them in love. And this complete renovation in the way he reads the Old Testament. Now Paul goes back and reads the same Old Testament, but he reads it in a spiritual sense, in an allegorical sense, in an anagogical sense, so that Sarah and Hagar become allegories, not literal women, but they become allegories for life in the Spirit or life according to the flesh. The rock from which the Israelites drink in the Old Testament ceases to be merely a rock and it becomes a type of Christ. But to have this renovation in understanding the Old Testament, Paul says you have to have the mind of Jesus. You actually have to come to see the world through Christ's eyes. You have to be converted. You have to meet Christ and completely revalue the way you see reality in order to benefit from this spiritual reading of the Old Testament. And Jesus teaches the exact same thing, that it's not enough to come into connection with the literal words of Jesus. One actually has to come to share in his way of seeing the world. It's not information that he wants to convey, it's a change of heart. And so in Mark chapter 10, for instance, the rich young ruler comes to Christ and says, what must I do to be saved? Well, Jesus, he wants a formula. Well, Jesus doesn't want to give him a formula.
Yeah.
So he says, you know what to do. Leave me alone. Why are you calling me good? Off you go. Go follow Moses. And the guy says, but no, I need something else. I need something more. And Jesus says, now we're getting somewhere. Sell everything you have. Come and follow me. Come participate in my way of being. Mm-hmm. Come learn with me to see the world as I see it. Then you can really be saved. Well, that's what the apostles did. You see, he called them to leave their nets, to leave their tax collecting booths and whatnot, and come follow him, to come share in his way of life. and therefore he was able to unfold to them the mysteries of the kingdom. Now, with those to whom he spoke in parables, they had not yet had this conversion. They hadn't yet come to see the world as Jesus sees it. What is the function of the parables? It's not to convey propositional information. The purpose of the parable is to get you to see yourself in a new light, to gain an insight on human relations.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of the parables, or many of them, I should say, have the effect of taking people that would have been perceived by Jesus' contemporaries as righteous and showing them as unrighteous, and people who would have been perceived as unrighteous and showing them to be righteous. I think it's Luke 17. There was the tax collector and the Pharisee in the temple. And the Pharisee says, I thank thee, God, that I'm not like that tax collector over there, because I do all this good stuff. And the tax collector, he says, have mercy on me, Lord, a sinner. And Christ says it's the latter rather than the former that goes home justified. Many of the parables have that form. Once you enter into the parables that Jesus has to use on the uninitiated, and you begin to revalue human relationships and see yourself in a new light, now you're able to pass into the mind of Christ and learn the mysteries of the kingdom that St. Paul learned on the road to Damascus. Now, that transformation from darkness to light, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, takes place only by a work of God's Spirit. Without the Spirit of God, the things of God are foolishness to the man of the world. But with the Spirit, what was formerly for us a letter that leads to death now becomes a promise that leads to life. That's the spiritual reading of the Bible, developed in Catholic tradition into the four senses of Scripture. The literal sense, on which the other three are built, but then the spiritual sense that gives us the moral, that aspirational or anagogical that points us towards heaven, and that typological or allegorical that we find fulfilled in Jesus.
Thanks so much for your call. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. Let's go to Toledo now and talk with Mark, who's listening on the great Ave Maria Radio. Mark, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon, and thank you. My wife and I are currently going through the RCIA process, and it's been wonderful. But my question is, my wife and I were both previously married, and we did complete the forms for the annulment through the Catholic Church. Now, I'm pretty sure that mine will be annulled because I know that the church didn't recognize mine because we were married my first time by a judge. However, I'm not so sure about my wife's, and I was just wondering, what do I do if for any reason hers doesn't get granted and mine does?
Okay, yeah, thanks. So let me ask you a question or two. I assume you did this with, you had guidance from your priest and from the tribunal in filling out the paperwork. I mean, you didn't just print this offline and do it on your own steam, right? I mean, you've already talked to the tribunal about the process, correct?
That is correct.
All right. Well, I'd say that if you've already been in communication with the tribunal and they've instructed you on how to proceed, they wouldn't tell you to proceed if they didn't think there were plausible grounds, right? So a lot of annulments never get off the ground to begin with because they don't really have a case, right? And so if people in the tribunal have already looked at your situation and said, yeah, we think there's a case here, go ahead and fill out the paperwork, I'd say right now again, I can't handicap the thing, but I'd say that's pretty good odds that they think that's a reasonable case to make. So I wouldn't be too discouraged or worried about it. Now, let's say that, this happens and one of you doesn't get granted the annulment. You can appeal. There are legal and canonical processes that you can go through, but ultimately, the purpose of the marriage tribunal, the purpose of the canonical court, is to find the truth. And I spoke to a canonist one time, and he said he would bend over backwards to help anybody who desired an annulment find valid grounds for an annulment. He would go to great lengths, and I will tell you that tribunal judges are human. They make mistakes, and I've heard of cases where the first time a judge looks at something, he misses something.
Yeah.
And says, oh, there's no grounds for annulment here. And then he comes back to the paperwork later and goes, well, I didn't see that the first time. And then, so, you can keep working. But his point was, I'm going to do my best to find for the cause of annulment if one exists, but I'm not going to hell for anyone. Like, ultimately, the judge takes a vow before God that he is not there just to please men, but to find the truth.
Of course.
And that should be all of our disposition, right? That the reason the tribunal exists is to find the truth of the matter. Now, if it were the case that one of you was in fact validly married to someone else, that now becomes a matter for very profound pastoral discernment that is highly particular to your situation, what children you have, what the former relationships are, things that are way beyond the scope of this show. Your situation in that case would not be unfamiliar to the church, not at all, and pastoral guidance would not be lacking. And so at that point, my suggestion would be, you exhaust your options, and then you just press in to the pastoral care of the church as hard as you can and get really good discernment and guidance from your priest on how to move forward.
Appreciate your call, Mark. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Tom Price here reminding you to join us for EWTN News Nightly tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, Tracy Sable takes a closer look at the possible candidates to be the newest Supreme Court Justice. Also, Cardinal Reinhard Marx apologizes for clergy sexual abuse in Germany. A lot of important things in the news, and we cover them all for you on EWTN News Nightly. Check it out tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern on EWTN radio and television. All right, we're going to go quickly to a question from Levi watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Levi says, is the use of cannabis accepted in the Catholic Church? I find it personally an equal to alcohol in terms of being used in moderation.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So the Church teaches that intoxication in any form is objectively immoral.
Okay.
So if you drink to become intoxicated, that's immoral. If you use cannabis to become intoxicated, that's immoral.
Okay. And there it is. Thank you so much for watching us this afternoon on YouTube, Levi. Appreciate hearing from you. Let's go now to Jerry in Porterville, California, listening on YouTube. Jerry, what's on your mind today?
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for taking my call. So my question is, why is it a big deal when Jesus called his mother woman during the wedding at Cana and at the foot of the cross, but not a big deal when he calls Mary Magdalene a woman at his resurrection?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So I think you have to look at the whole context of the narrative in John chapter 2, which is typological through and through. I mean, the language of the purification jars filled with water that Christ turns to wine at the word of his mother, of course, recalls to our minds the purification rites of the Old Covenant, which are insufficient to purify the soul from sin, whereas the New Covenant given to us in Jesus, that, of course, is typified, exemplified, and manifest by the transubstantiation of bread and wine in the Holy Eucharist. This is when Jesus, as Scott Hahn loves to point out, this is when the word New Testament, New Covenant, is actually used, when Christ says, this is the cup of the New Covenant in my blood, right? So the efficacious rites of the Church to purify from sin are contrasted with the merely ritual elements of Hebrew law, and the wedding feast at Cana is a typological demonstration of the move from the one to the other. Now, it happens at the word of a woman who says, do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you, which is the opposite of our first mother Eve, who did not do whatever she was told and led the human race into ruin, of course, along with our first father Adam. But here, the mother of our Redeemer is the prompt for Jesus's performing his very first sign, which has this profound typological significance. So I think you have to look at it in that context. Also remember that in Revelation chapter 12, there is a woman who is depicted as in conflict with that ancient serpent, the devil. So the comparison to Eve is very evident. And yet we are told she is the one who will give birth to the child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. That's a reference to Psalm 2, which is a messianic psalm. So the identification of Mary with Eve and as the woman of the new covenant occurs in more than one place in the New Testament. And it's context. You know how they say, like, the only one rule in real estate is location.
Yes.
Well, in exegesis, it's context.
There you go. Jerry, thanks so much for your call. Let's go to Tyson's Corner, Virginia, and we'll talk with Dave, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Dave, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon, fellas. How are you?
Doing very well.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, go right ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, we're here.
Can you hear us?
Good. There you are, Dr. Anders. How are you?
Great. How about you?
Good. Quick question for you. I'm looking for a good book on, funny enough, your last subject there was typology.
I got it.
And I'm looking for a book that connects all the dots for me.
I got a bunch for you. All right. So the first one I want you to look at is actually a document from the Holy See. It's called Verbum Domini. It's the post-synodal exhortation on the Word of God that was published under the authority of Pope Benedict XVI. Very good text on the interpretation of Holy Scripture. So that's number one. If you want some patristic references, read St. Gregory of Nyssa on the life of Moses. Read Augustine of Hippo on Christian doctrine. It's one of the earliest treatises on biblical interpretation in the Church. Read Bible Study Basics for Catholics by John Bergsma. Read Daniel Harrington's book, How Catholics Read the Bible. If you want to see typology done in real time, cooking before your very eyes, read John Paul II's Theology of the Body. So all of these are great resources. Oh, and if you want to see a good theologian thinking about typological interpretation when wrestling with the hardest texts of the Old Testament, read Matthew Ramage's book, The Dark Passages of the Bible.
Wow. Some great resources there for you, Dave. Thanks so much for your call from Tyson's Corner, Virginia. Going now to Luke, very patiently listening to us in Ave Maria, Florida, via podcasting. Hello, Luke. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I was reading a biography of St. Benedict Joseph Labre, and when it was describing him being a pilgrim in Italy in the 18th century, the biography made several references to him needing to show a communion certificate and a confession certificate to the priest. And I was wondering if you could please clarify what that practice was and what became of it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. So until the 20th century, in the Latin West, it was the practice for many centuries that the laity would only commune once a year. And depending on what diocese you were in, being admitted to Holy Communion once a year could be a bit of an arduous process. If you have ever read the sermons of St. John Vianney, you'll know that a great many of them pertain to preparation for one's annual communion. And the Curé of Ars would always admonish people that they needed to come to confession. And if they came to confession, he wasn't just going to hear their confession and absolve them and admit them to communion. He was going to insist that they reform their life. And so if they were up to something that he didn't think they ought to be up to, unless they forswore that activity, he said, well, then I'm not going to admit you to Holy Communion.
Wow.
And he was a bit persnickety, let's say, the Curé of Ars. And so he was not letting pass some things that I think would probably get passed today. Like he was not into, gambling and drinking and saloons and all that kind of stuff, And so it used to kind of get under the skin of the young men in France because their grandmothers and mamas wanted them to make their annual communion, and they went to the priest in a perfunctory sort of way, and he was like, I'm not letting you off that easy just because grandmama wants you to come to communion. And he would preach, I know you could go down the hill here to the next parish and get Father Laxity to let you in, no problems. Don't do that. Don't go to Father Laxity. You got to come to me, and I'll admit you to Holy Communion if I think that you've done what you need doing. All right. So this is the context in which somebody might want to have certified that they had in fact been to confession and received permission from the priest to go to Holy Communion. Now, obviously today, with the practice of frequent communion in the church, which is the norm now, I mean, most Catholics receive communion every week when they go to Mass, they are a little bit on the honor system. So you should not go to communion if you're conscious of grave sin. Church tells you should go to sacramental confession first and receive absolution, which is the same thing as receiving that permission from the priest to go to communion. But it's a little bit the honor system, and it would be you can't have it both ways. You can't have frequent communion and this level of scrutiny.
Yeah, makes
sense. So you're either going to have annual communion and super scrutiny, or you're going to have frequent communion and not so much scrutiny.
Thanks for your call, Luke. I think we have time for one, maybe two more calls. Here is Claude now in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, listening on YouTube. Claude, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you today?
Very well. What's on your mind?
Very good. Would like to know, where does the Catholic Church stand on psychiatry? Do they agree with it or not? And do they feel, is it a necessary practice?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. The Church is of the opinion that when science can demonstrate something to be true, then it's true, right? So if I can reasonably discern the truth of something using my natural faculties, then that's true, and Revelation's not going to contradict that. And with the growth of medical practice and diagnostics, we are in a better position today to understand the nature of mental health problems than we were, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And we have discerned that there are therapeutic approaches, therapeutic benefits that can be derived from pharmacology that can really help to alleviate psychiatric conditions. Since the Church is about alleviating suffering and trying to get people healthy in body, mind, and spirit, if there is a medical route to mental health, then that's a legitimate practice. Now, to say that does not mean that the Catholic Church endorses, every philosophy or every metaphysical supposition that might underlie, this or that psychiatric practice. Maybe a lot of neurologists and psychiatrists might be atheists, and they might proceed with atheistic assumptions. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't concede their atheism, but it might concede that, this particular drug is helpful with schizophrenia. You say. Yeah, there you go. Claude, thanks so much for your question, and we're going to try to squeeze in Audrey in Somerville, South Carolina. Audrey, we got about a minute. What's on your mind today?
Hi, I love your show. Thank you guys so much. I want to know, did Jesus know that Judas was going to betray him when he chose Judas?
Yep, sure did.
And chose him anyway?
You bet.
Yeah, for God's good purposes.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
There you go. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. We actually got that answered super quick. Let me, can we get to, no. We cannot get to Rebecca in Traverse City, Michigan, because it would take a little more than, 28 seconds to, figure out a good. So, Rebecca, would you please call us back tomorrow? And we will put you at the head of the line. All you have to do is say, hey, I got left here. we couldn't get to it today, and we will definitely get to it tomorrow. We'll put you at the head of the line. All right, Dr. David Anders.
Thanks, Tom.
Great show. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you kindly.
All right, and don't forget, we do this program here on EWTN Radio at 2 p.m. Eastern each day, Monday through Friday, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. Couple of extra bonus things to tell you about. First of all, there is the Best of Call to Communion. We air that for you on Saturday afternoons, also at 2 p.m. Eastern. And you can check out the podcast, listen to previous shows, listen to today's show, whatever you want. Charles will have that posted for you a little bit later on this afternoon at EWTNradio.net, EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our fantastic team, today that would be Charles, Rich, and Jeff. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders. Thanks for joining us here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Hope to see you tomorrow right here on EWTN. God bless.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.